All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Doesn't this weather feel better than yesterday? This is good. This feels perfect. Thanks for coming to Thursday's afternoon craft talk with Laura Pritchett. Out of the sheets, onto the page, sex scenes. It's all part of the theme of love this year at Summer Fishtrap. Truth be told, back a couple years ago, Laura Pritchett did a similar craft talk, which was very popular. And then when we were putting together this year's schedule, I got in touch with Laura and said, hey, did you do that writing good sex scenes? Consider doing it. She said, yeah, I'll rework it. It'll be great. And it is. And I think it's a great offering, especially for this theme and this year. Just a couple of notes. After this, at 3 o'clock, is a panel discussion on writing, talking about writing from other people's perspective, about other people. You know, how can I write a story from the perspective of a little girl or a person of a different orientation or background? We had a panel discussion like this that with Nina McConnelly and Jamie Ford back in 2018. It was fascinating, and that conversation has continued to develop over the past 6 years. I think it'll be very valuable. One other logistics thing, starting tonight, they're serving dinner in the canvas room as well as the red, but you have to make reservations, so make reservations at the front desk if you want to eat through the canvas room instead of here. They asked me to ask that. And with that, I think we'll just get going. I have a few more handouts. But let's go. Laura Pritchett you're doing your featured reading tomorrow. So make sure you note that, and we'll just get going. Thanks for being here this afternoon. The vibe at Summer Fishtrap on a Thursday is one of the best feelings I've had ever. This is a great group, and you all seems like everybody's having a great time. So, without further ado, Laura Pritchett.
Thank you. Love. The summer of love. I love it. We have heard so many readings that are about love. Love of a partner, Aaron Abeda's Calculus of You is one of my favorite poems of his. Love of body, love of our country, love of our culture. So we've heard a lot of love. And so I just want to add to that today. I want to talk about writing about sex. I'll tell you what I'm not. I'm not an erotica writer. I'm not a romance novel writer. I'm all for it, but that's not what I do. I'm just a regular, everyday writer. And but I think sex should be there. So I embarked upon a study. So there should be handouts. If you don't have one, there's not enough, but maybe you could sidle up next to someone who has one and take a photo. And also, we're going to do a little bit of free writing at the end, so if you have a journal and pen, that would be amazing. And if you don't, you'll have your brain or your phone or something, perhaps. If you want to rifle around now, go for it. So, yeah, I'm here to talk about sex. My daughter called me yesterday, and she's reading my novel that comes out a week from yesterday. And she said, thank you, I'm so excited for it. And she said, this is terrible, I have to pretend it's not you who wrote it, and then it's fine. Which is like, as far as I know, you only had sex twice. Once for me and once for Jake. My kids, but anyway, yes, I talk about sex, much to my kids' dismay. I also love that there's a deer here listening underneath the deck. Just like chewing our cud, listening about sex. All right, sex. So, I'm here to talk about sex, but first, I want to talk about stealing and sex. So, I want to start by this favorite quote of mine, one of my favorites by F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote, I want to be able to do anything with words, handle slashing, flaming descriptions like Wells, use the paradox with clarity of Samuel Butler, the breadth of Bernard Shaw, and the wit of Oscar Wilde. I want to do the wide, sultry heavens of Conrad, the rolled gold sundowns and crazy quilt skies of Hitchens and Kipling, as well as the pastel dawns and twilights of Chesterton. All that is by way of example. As a matter of fact, I am a professed literary thief. hot after the best methods of every writer in my generation. And of course, the writers of our generation have changed, but how many people kind of practice thievery in that you just like notice what somebody else is doing and you're like, right on, yeah. Nice. So I think we are professional literary thieves, even if we don't know it, because of course we're always absorbing and taking and studying that which we read. We steal style. Think of how we might steal like stream of consciousness versus spare prose, the stained glass versus the clear window of Faulkner versus Hemingway. We steal plot. One of my favorite examples being The Hours by Michael Cunningham, who basically stole the plot of Mrs. Dalloway and redid it. We also steal, for a lack of a better term, the vibe of something. For example, using epigraphs as a way to get to the spirit, energy, or message of another author's work. And we steal nerve. We've probably all felt exhilarated after reading an author who makes us feel differently. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, after reading the first line of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, wrote, "When I read that line, I thought to myself that I didn't know anyone was allowed to write things like that. If I had known, I would have started writing a long time ago. So immediately, I started writing." It is in regard to this last method of stealing that I want to direct my comments right now, specifically about the nerve for writing about sex. I have always favored writers who are real and raw with their hearts and souls. I really dislike writing that's emotionally muted and safe. We as writers must be as honest as we can with ourselves and with our readers, the kind of honesty that can make us blush and sick to our stomach, as if we cannot bear to show such internal truths. But we can, and we must. Because only in that way do we write about our connectedness, but that can be hard. So a decade or so ago, I started a writing project, and the major theme I knew was going to be sexuality, one of the major themes. And I was getting into some pretty awkward territory for me, awkward to put on the page at least. And I guess I wanted reassurance that I wasn't alone. So I started looking around and doing what I always do, which is start out by like tearing books out of my library and seeing what other people are doing. And I needed to steal the nerve, basically, the nerve to write about sex. And I was paying close attention. I love all genres, and I respect all genres, but I was paying close attention to what literary writers were doing with sex. Sorry, I got to take this off because it's choking me in the back of my neck. So what I was wondering is, like, who is doing sex scenes well? Who is doing it poorly? Why is one sex scene awesome and another one super laughable and like makes you wince? Who is writing about sex as it really is? The one, not only the wonderful orgasmic stuff, but the sometimes mundane, irritating, boring, hurtful, or yes, fabulous thing it can be. As in, I wasn't so interested in people writing about porn or gratuitous sex. I was really interested in human, complicated, wonderful sex. So I have to say, my first, I started taking books off my shelf and flipping through for sex scenes. I felt like I was when I was a teenager, like going through my mom's shelves, like, where's the sex scenes in those books? So I can figure out what it is that people are talking about. And I have this whole, my kids never saw it, but this whole part of my library in my office that is just like tagged with sex scenes, with sticky notes. And if only they had known, they probably could have, like saved themselves a lot of time. But my main observation was I was super, genuinely surprised at the amount of times good authors let the characters wander off into the bedroom, took a chapter break, and we start off on the next day, and there is no mention of the sex, except that maybe it happened. And years seem to go by in these characters' lives with no sex, or even thinking about sex, or yearning for sex, or wishing for sex. And I guess that's believable, in certain stories and in certain circumstances, but in other cases, let's face it, the authors were just taking the easy way out and kind of letting us down, I think. They were avoiding the big elephant in the room because it's hard to write about that big elephant in the room. To fail to mention some form of sexuality seemed kind of ridiculous. It's just too great a part of the human condition. So I think it's fair to say that in general, sexuality, for a while there at least, was being ignored or overlooked or only put into certain genres. and totally left out of other genres, including some really good fiction and nonfiction. So then I started doing research in earnest, like Googling sex in fiction, New York Times, or, like something like that. I always think, like, if anyone ever looked I know all of you writers, like, if anyone looked at your search history, they would be like, wow, this person's crazy. They're, like, Googling how to murder someone with a rattlesnake and sex scenes in, literature. But, so I came across this great quote by Jane Smiley, who's one of my favorite writers. And in an interview about this book, 10 Days in the Hill, which is very sexually explicit, she noted in an article in the New York Times that there was a long early tradition of writing about sex. And she pointed us to Chaucer, Cervantes. Like, if you look at those texts, a lot of sex in the Bible, too, if you look there. She writes about, and then suddenly, like, sex fell from the contemporary literary novel. So I'm going to quote her. She writes, "The joys as well as the dilemmas of sex, love, and their complications lost their footing in literature, in the novel, and in large part fell away as novels became more respectable, especially to middle-class readers. Relationship in the novel became less sexy, conformed more to social conventions. She wanted to bring sex back, not for pornographic intent, she said, but for artistic intent, for the pleasures of working with new material and the insights to be gained by looking into the sexual world of her characters." So of this book, John Updike said in a review that it, quote, "set a new mark for explicitness and a work of non-pornographic intent." Jane Smiley, I believe, was pleased, and so was I, and I really recommend the book. So other writers are doing it too, touching on sexuality, and here are a couple of my favorite fictions. Oh, and I put myself up there just because this is the book I was working on, The Blue Hour, when I started all this research. And there's the premise of that book is that the early chapter is quite traumatic. Somebody commits suicide, but the rest of the book is everyone else in the mountain community trying to love a little better and be a little more true to their partner and connect a little more deeper, and a lot of that involves sexuality. So that book started this whole journey into who's writing sex. So that's some of fiction, some nonfiction. Sex, Sin, and Zen is kind of a nonfiction, wonderful look at Buddhism and sex. And John Rechy's memoir is a beautiful memoir of him realizing he was gay. And then my most recent read was Between Two Kingdoms, and in which she yearns for sex, but it's a young woman who's been diagnosed with cancer and is undergoing treatments. And some of you may know her book and story. She's married to the musician John Baptiste, yes. And they have a film out about him. Yes, there's a question. On the previous slide? Sure. A great short story collection is called Lust and Other Stories by Susan Minot. That's pretty famous about sexual encounters. Cleanness by Garth Greenwell came out a few years ago about his sexual journey. That's about his character's sexual journey. Vox is a novel that's told completely on a sex phone line, like a sex call. What are those called? Yeah. Difficult Women by Roxane Gay has a lot of sex in it. Erica Young, Fear of Flying, of course, is the classic, right? We all found that in the library, I think, or people of a certain age went and found that one. And their Fermata by Nicholson Baker is about a man who can stop time, like a fermata in music. He can stop time, and then he does some like weirdly sexual things that you don't entirely like him for, but it explores like a man's questioning of his sexuality. So that's the fiction. Nonfiction, I've kind of mentioned memoirs mainly. Poetry, it's showing up in poetry everywhere. Fabulous. Time as a Mother, Ocean Vuong's work has a lot of very sexual, tender writing in it. Billy Collins, addresses sex often in very hilarious ways. And he has some love poems that remind me very much of Aaron Abeda's, comparing love to something else. Zenith of Desire, Contemporary Lesbian Poems is the subtitle. Contemporary Lesbian Poems about Sex and Passionate Hearts. There's somebody else in the audience here who I noticed has some very beautiful, right there, and her book is for sale in there. I was reading this one like a month ago, Give Us Our Daily Ecstasy, and I was like, oh yeah. I don't quote the entire poem here, but yes. So anyway, I'm finding it everywhere. But I looked to these writers because I wanted to write about sex. And to be honest, I just didn't want to feel shamed. As we all know, shame is like the most uncomfortable of human emotions that there is. So I wanted to get past whatever was like keeping me from getting as real and raw as I could. And I like to think I'm open-minded and sure I can write about sex, but I found that I was like encountering barriers that I didn't know I had. Like, can I really write about it, like as it really is? Or am I letting cultural assumptions about what's okay, infuse what I'm doing? So I have to say all these authors and more gave me the courage. And while reading and paying attention to all the sex scenes, I came across fantastically written sex scenes of boring sex and fabulous sex scenes of fabulous sex. And there are sex scenes in which no sex occurs, and there are entire novels based on one interlude in bed, my favorite being Rapture by Susan Minot. The whole entire novel is two people in bed. So I came across descriptions of masturbation, of fantasy, of phone sex, and I respected these authors. Because first, they had the courage to do it, and then I respected the way they wrote them. There was a great article by Katie Rolfe, who took on the task of writing about sex in the New York Times Sunday Book Review in an article called The Naked and the Conflicted. She brings up several good points, my favorite being that some contemporary writers seem to think that sex and physical love and sexual connection is somehow uncool, not worthy of respect. Many authors treat it with irony or ambivalence or self-consciousness or discomfort or trepidation. And she takes authors to task for this, for being too smart, too sophisticated, too busily progressive. She wants to know, are we no longer capable of attaching words like exuberance or mystery or power or beauty or epic or celebration or spiritual or immortality to sexual experience and connection in literature or in life? Is it passé? Well, that's a really good question, and I often teach some works in which I say, like, look, we might be afraid of being sentimental, so therefore we avoid true sentiment. Like, we want to get to real sentiment, we just don't want the sentimentality. But to avoid real sentiment is a disaster. How can we talk about what our real sentiment is, our real love, our real passions, our real sorrows? They can get sentimental and Hallmark cardy, and we're trying to avoid the Hallmark cardy, unless you're a Hallmark card writer, in which case, awesome. But we want to get to real sentiment without sentimentality. And that takes, get rid of the ironicness around, let that go, get real and more open and genuine. So her answer and mine is that no, it is not passé. Sex does matter. It changes us. It changes our characters. And so the next obvious thing I learned is that from the study of the greats about writing about sex is that sex is there for a reason. Sex is a fabulous way to symbolically show what is otherwise difficult to translate, to characterize, to move the plot forward. And I'd like to give a couple examples of a few and some writing prompts. That's Susan Minot's book, Rapture. So The Blue Hour came out, and I just want to say that I was so pleased when a lot of the blurbers focused in on the sexuality of the book. Carolyn Levitt offered a nice blurb, for example, because that's exactly what I was trying for, and it's nice to have someone notice what you were trying to do. And then I also included a lot of sex, or not a lot, but some sex in Playing with Wildfire, which I'll read from a little bit tomorrow night, which is a wildfire is coming into a community, and everyone's deciding whether or not to evacuate, but they're also like falling in love or out of love or having sex for the first time. And so the book is about healing after trauma, and the final chapter is a sex scene, for which I chose for just this reason, like sex can heal us and bring us together. And then in the 3 keys, the book I mentioned that's coming out in a few days, it's about a woman who has lost her husband and her job, and her son has just moved off to college, and so she's setting off on a road trip to break into people's homes, and she has 3 keys that she's going to do that with. But she misses sex. Her husband's been gone for more than a year, and they weren't having a great sex life right, before then. And so I just want to say that sometimes a sex scene to me is like commenting on the lack of and the wish for. And she, at the very beginning, she starts off and she gets into a bathtub after sleeping in her car for the first time, and I just want to read one line. She had the vague notion that she could make herself have an orgasm, which would be the first in more than a year and a half, her last being with Vincent, one love, making Saturday morning, but that seemed too blasphemous to even wonder about. But also, the sad honest truth was that it was equally blasphemous to have her body atrophy more fully into menopause and away from something she had liked about herself. She had loved sex. She had loved being sexual. And so like the lack of sex is important to her character development. So it's there for a reason. And then, I don't want to give the plot away, but chapter 20, she finds somebody. And and I'm not mentioning my own work out of ego, I'm just by way of example. What she's yearning for is to kind of recapture some of her youth, except that you can't really do that. You're like now the human you are now. But I did want to set her first sexual encounter someplace special that reminds her of youth. So at first I had written it in a bed in a hotel room, but I was like, no way, man, it should occur in the back of a car, as like so many teenage experiences are. And so anyway, like where we choose to have sex matters. So I wanted to pause right now to just have you consider, you could journal or you could just sit and think and meditate for a moment. What have been the big sexual moments of your life? It could be the time you stopped having sex or wanted to stop having sex, or that you first, you lost your virginity, or you had sex for the first time where you were really deeply in love. That's a different thing, sometimes. And then just maybe make a list and put a star by one you'd like to write about. And then also consider, like, how does that make you feel? How comfortable are you doing that? And is there any way you can push yourself gently and with respect for your boundaries into writing into that scene a little bit more? So however you want to answer some of these questions, I'll just pause for like 2 minutes and let you think. Hopefully you've written enough to get addicted to this list and come back. That's always my goal, just to cause an addiction. It's a healthy addiction, though, as far as addictions go. Just to get into this list and wonder what you could write about. Or, for those writing fiction, surely your character had a first sexual experience or an important sexual experience. So basically, so far, what I've mentioned is just the call to action. Like, let's do it. Let's write the sex scenes. Let's listen to these critics and, defy the social pressures. And maybe we don't feel them, in which case, awesome. But let's examine that. Let's see what's pushing on us and see if we can write about something very human, very important, and write about it well and respectfully and gracefully and truly, deeply, honestly. So that's the first call. So the trick is now, okay, how? How do we do it? So I want to start by mentioning Steve Almond. No one can really think about sex scenes without thinking of Steve Almond. Anybody read this hilarious essay, the 12-step program? It's easily findable on the internet. You just Google Steve Almond 12-step program. It is hilarious. Do not read it with kids around. And for that kid reason, just to be, I'm glad there's none here because this is one of those moments that isn't appropriate for all audiences. But it's just so funny. But I didn't want to just read his essay. You can go read his essay. It's just so good. But I will mention he has a new writing book out called Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow, in which he has a whole chapter on writing sex scenes, in which he's using a lot of the same points that comes out in that article. And I just took this from an article he wrote in Writer's Digest, How to Write Better Sex Scenes, that just came out May 2024. And he writes, so let's just say it. The biggest problem when it comes to sex scenes is that they never get written. They never get written because of their own inhibitions, because of our own inhibitions, and because, to one degree or another, we suffer from performance anxiety. This is why writers so often skip the part where the lovers are fumbling out of their clothes, their rude parts, and their hearts safely tucked away. This pressure leads to all mistakes associated with pressure, unnecessary similes and metaphors, needless obfuscation, genital euphemisms, histrionics that wind up feeling imposed by the author instead of experienced by the characters. So this is a great craft book and a great chapter on sex scenes, and I won't repeat what he has to say because you can go read it. But his first call to action is to write them. Okay, so in 1990, I want to talk about what to do by talking about what not to do. In 1993, Auberon Waugh, son of Evelyn, established the Literary Review's Bad Sex and Fiction Awards. Anybody follow this? Hilarious. I hope you will Google it. The Bad Sex and Fiction Awards, with the aim of, quote, this is their mission statement, quote, gently dissuading authors and publishers from including unconvincing, perfunctory, embarrassing, or redundant passages of a sexual nature in otherwise sound literary novels. So when you read, you become aware of the fact that, yes, bad sex scenes can be written, and they've poked fun at a lot of people, and the authors have been very gracious in receiving these awards. The Bad Sex Award shortlist includes some big names, including Philip Roth, Salman Rushdie, and Tom Wolfe. But my personal number one goes to John Updike for this winning episode. And I hope there's no kids here. No. Standing with her, Isabel, in the warming waterfall, soaping her skin so its yielding silk was overlaid with a white grease, and then letting her soap him, in turn, he felt his cashew become a banana, and then a rippled yam bursting with weight. Yeah, he gets to win that award. That's John Updike, man. And so if he's going to mess it up, I think we can mess it up too. But we got to be brave enough to try. Updike has been very gracious about this. He has been nominated 4 times. And then he finally bagged the Lifetime Achievement Award from this award. But, let's face it, he does have a lengthy and frank and graphic sex in his works. In the Rabbit series, The Witches of Eastwick, The Couples, which the Atlantic Monthly dubbed the most sexually explicit novel in memory. And it earned him, quote, a permanent place in the bad sex stratosphere. He has said, writing my sex scenes physically excites me as it should. But this overwrought food analogy just had them giggling. So you can find all of them at the Flavor Wire. But a more recent winner is another author I truly love, Elizabeth Gilbert. Right? We love her. We love her. Here's the passage she won for. Then I screamed as though I was being run over by a train, which just sounds so bad. And that long arm of his was reaching up to palm my mouth, and I bit into his hand the way a wounded soldier bites onto a bullet. Which, ow, So, we know what not to do. And what not to do, obviously, is to get into this overwrought, over-exuberant comparisons or comparisons to something that have nothing to do with the scene that is unfolding. I have a couple other tricks on what I found made me giggle and laugh, and I just compiled I looked at all the sex scenes that I thought were not well written and kind of came up with what not to do. The first thing is, and this should be in your handout, a sex scene is not a sex manual. It doesn't need to go, like every piece of writing, it doesn't need to go bit by bit every moment in time. We get to skip. We get to leap, don't creep, as they say. We get to jump to the good parts. So it's not like a how-to guide or a moment by moment. Don't skip it when it's a cop-out. The thing that drives me craziest is when there's a chapter break, and whatever happened in that bedroom was important, and we should have been there with them. But include it only when it matters. It shouldn't just be there for sex, because that's gratuitous sex, and that's porn, and I'm not interested in that. It should be there because the characters are learning something or feeling something or being vulnerable, and so it needs to be there for a reason that matters. And for all you fiction writers, I just close my eyes for a minute and put your two characters in some kind of, in bed or wherever you want them, and think about what vulnerabilities are being established there, and how are the two people connecting, and it'll be very revealing. And for memoir writers, the same. And then you have to decide, what can you reveal and what can't you. So what is it revealing? Also, if there was ever a time to be aware of cliches, now is it. No cigs as phallic symbols, no rolls in the hay, no heaving breasts, no panting. You can find other words. We are writers. We can come up, we just had an exercise in my class today in which we were coming up with fresh and unique phrases for everything, so as to stay away from the cliches. But especially, I think the most important thing, as we have seen, is to stay away from the dreaded food analogies. Or if you're going to do it so that people laugh. I'm just not sure they work. The other thing, and Steve Ullman talks a lot about this, is beware your terminology for sexual organs. Some are too scientific, some are too slang. Actually, in Perrin's talk, right, that big long list of words used to describe a woman's sexual parts, like some of them are weird, and some are painful, and some are beautiful, but beware of the slang you're using. And scientific words can, I don't think many of us actually use them unless we are going to a doctor's office. And so if you're writing a sex scene, to be aware of those. I'm not even sure that in the best love poems or sex poems or writing, we even use the word love or sex, right? We find other ways to approach those. And on this slide, I have TTR, which is my short way of saying trust thy reader. Trust thy reader that they are as smart as you are, that they get it, that you don't need to name the body part down there in some awkward way. We know which body part you're talking about, and we can, you can describe it if you want, but just, trust that we understand what's going on. Because the act itself isn't that different or interesting for people. It's what's happening emotionally around it that makes it interesting. Okay, so those are some things I would avoid. Tips on doing it right. Reconsider its absence is the most obvious number one. Like if you're writing a memoir, for example, you might say, ooh, I can't write about that. But we actually might want to write about our very first time we were at the playground and we noticed an interesting sensation in between our legs. Or you might want to, it might actually be part of your development of who you are as a person, your first awareness of sexuality. So, but only include if it matters and connect it to the larger themes of the work. The needs and the histories of your characters should drive the sex scene. For example, I guess I could have totally left out any sexual mention at all of Amelie, but I just find it hard to believe that she could be embarking on a midlife journey into a fuller life without considering where she's at sexually and what she misses and what she wants and what's comfortable for her in a menopausal body. And so, I couldn't skip it. I had to bring it up in this book. Otherwise, it would feel fake and flat to me. But so her needs, her desires for a more full life are driving the work. So, which means basically, and this is true for any writing. I mean, I think this class could have just been called good writing, things to think about when writing. But is that you're combining details of the external world, like the bed, the sheets, the picnic blanket, the hot tub, whatever your setting is, with the internal landscape of your characters. Her hopes, her fears, her vulnerabilities, what she wants. And so, as fiction writers know, that's called the horizontal story, what's going on through time, the plot, X, Y, Z happens, but then the vertical story, like what's going on inside her heart and body and mind, and how is she developing a character arc? How is she growing? So you're doing both at once in every sex scene. Another trick, and Steve has some wise things to say about this, is to please own the complexity of the situation. Like, rarely is a sex scene just great or just terrible. Well, it can be just terrible, but and that's a very serious different talk. But we have to avoid simplifying everything. For example, it's never going to be just one thing, like desire. It could be desire and a vulnerability about something. It could be desire, but also somebody has a cramp in their foot. It could be desire, but also an awareness that what they're doing is problematic because they're having an affair, or it's gonna mess up their friendship or something. So there's always like complex emotions going on, and if you can capture all of that in the sex scene, that's what's gonna make it flourish as a sex scene. As in, there's lots going on, not just one thing. Time sequencing is something that we all think about when we're writing scenes, right? Because sometimes, real time, something could take 5 seconds, but we give it 5 pages because it mattered very much. And other times we condense 5 months into one sentence. So we expand and contract time because we're not rendering life as it really is, we're rendering a shaped narrative. That's our job, whether we're writing fiction or nonfiction. And so we slow down time, we speed up time. So it seems to me a really great time to slow down time is during the sex scene, because there's so many senses, all the senses are being involved, smells and touches and sights and feelings and emotions. And it's really a time to slow it down, give it the page count it deserves, because if you've chosen to include it, it's very important. Steve Almond's step 8 in that 12-step program is stop actually having sex. This is very important. Remember that the sexiest thing about sex is really desire. And so he always slows down his sex scenes right before the sex occurs. It's like not actually the sex act, it's the 5 minutes leading up to the sex act that's super interesting. And as people are like awkwardly deciding, like, is this happening, or how is this happening, or how's this gonna go, especially, you know, if they're new at it. And so slow down those few minutes right before a sex scene is one piece of advice. As we know, the famous Annie Dillard quote, "The way to a reader's emotions, oddly enough, is through the senses." The way to impact a reader's emotions is to use the senses. The sight, smell, touch, sound, hearing, all that. Like, by rendering something... Kim, what was that wonderful quote you gave the other day? That a landscape that's not... a landscape that's not evocatively described is easier to destroy. Okay, that is such a great quote, but I'm going to kind of mutate it here. A scene of two humans coming together that is not evocatively described is not going to be interesting. And so let's evocatively describe it, because that is how the reader is going to feel the glee or the frustration or the awkwardness or the passion. So use all of those senses, and make sure, you know, most of us are very visual, make sure you stop and do those writing exercises that, like, what do the bodies smell like? And maybe it's not like delicious vanilla. Maybe it's underarm smell. That can be very sexy too. Like, get real, you know, like, really describe it. And what do the bodies taste like? And what does the air feel like? Like, really sink into that evocative place. But use those senses in non-cliche ways. And the way we do that is to defamiliarize the familiar. We find a way to describe something in an unfamiliar way by using new verbs, new nouns, smashing them together in unique ways. And one thing I always do in every novel, but especially in sex scenes, is to pick a holding image that is, and by holding image I mean like a metaphor that's doing the work of holding what's going on. And so in one of my books that isn't published yet, but Billy keeps saying he's over the waterfall. And the waterfall comes to symbolize he's just falling into the need for connection with the woman he's in love with. He's over the waterfall. So I picked that image so that he could quit saying, like, I'm so horny, I'm so lusty, I love her so much, you know? He just kept saying, I'm over the waterfall. So can you come up with a phrase or an image that does that metaphor work, which all readers love, right? Of having one thing stand in for another thing, and helps us access the truth of it. I have this slide called for nonfiction writers in particular, but I don't know if it's really just for nonfiction writers. But maybe it is, I don't know. Be vulnerable. Like, if you're writing a memoir, let us in on your tender moments, good or bad, of your sexual being and awakening. And don't stand in judgment of you or anybody else in your life. Stand in curiosity. You do have to take responsibility for who you affect, for example. Like, I certainly wouldn't write anything that put someone in my life in a spotlight that they don't want. And that's true generally for memoir, right? At the same time, honor your story, own your truth, decide what you won't touch, decide what you will, and then check in with yourself. Is it unfair serving the story? If not, cut it. If so, keep it. Okay, so now I just wanted to mention a few writing exercises that have helped me, and I think several of these have were writing prompts given to me at one time or another over the years, and they all turn into published stories, so I really like them. The first, though, is to just get comfortable with the distance you want to take. Like, check in with yourself. How comfortable are you? And you might say, oh, I'm pretty open-minded and comfortable, but you still might have your mom's voice in your head, or, you know, some ideas of what's not appropriate. So just maybe take a minute to listen to the voices that are telling you to be quiet and don't write about it, and kind of interrogate them and investigate them. And then for the sake of time, we won't do this, but one of my favorite things is to take 2 or more characters and get them into bed or wherever, and then first write a sex scene that you might even be able to show your mom, like it's super distanced and carefully rendered, sweet, and then rewrite it so that it's so open, so descriptive, so, camera zoomed right in and rotating over the bodies that, it might even make you blush. And so just kind of like explore different ways of approach, I guess, and distance that you want to take. This is the one that the writing prompts that have really helped me. One, write about one or more of these, sex in which one person is sad, sex from the point of view of an older couple thinking of their younger selves, or a younger couple thinking of their older selves having sex, because then you get to move through time. People who are maybe having sex for conception only, or some reason other than like regular passion. And then a real love scene. Has anyone noticed that like happy people are hard to write about? They are, because they're not changing. And once I was at the Iowa Writers Summer thing, and they asked me to write a happy sex scene between 2 people. And it turned into a story about Gretchen and Joe. But they were just truly both really happy. It was so hard to write. So I'm just going to be quiet for 2 minutes while maybe you pick one of these and jot down some notes. For the sake of time, I'll have you finish your thought or line. Write yourself a note. And here are, there's a couple more prompts on the handout, but here's the one, of course, or here's one that helps me. For one thing, get into the senses. What do your characters smell like, taste like? What do they look like from afar? What do they look like close up? I always think of a camera zooming in and out. Compare them to something. What does the skin feel like, the clothing? How does the body feel? Does someone's stomach hurt? For me, the back of the neck is always an interesting thing to describe. Like, it can feel so many different ways. It's such a sensitive part of the body. So describing that is maybe even more sexy than describing any of the sexual, quote, sexual body parts. Sounds, what are the sounds made by lovers? What are the sounds in the outside world? And importantly, what is the sexiest thing about what's going on right now? And I think that's often what Updike was trying to get to in his sex scenes, is like they are kind of sexy. Like, we're making fun of him, and he's good-natured about that. But what is the sexiest thing about what's going on? Who's enjoying what and for what reason? And where exactly is the desire most felt? And sometimes that's surprising. Sometimes it can be the brain, right? So I'll just be quiet for another minute while you think about these. Hopefully you got going on something that you can finish this afternoon. I do want to say one more thing I meant to say about, like, does someone's stomach hurt or a cramp in the foot or something? I have this photo I took from my home of this glorious rainbow coming down, very sweet rainbow, and then it kind of lands in a dumpster that I had outside, a turquoise dumpster. And it's so funny, but because, it's not what you would expect. But that is my metaphor of, like, how to stay away from cliches, is you always balance the beauty with, like, some, I call it just get in the dumpster. Like, something unpleasant is probably also happening, or something a little less than, like, ideal angel singing hallmarky awesomeness. So as soon as you introduce something like that, like a cramp in the foot, you don't run the risk of being cliche anymore. It's not just, angels singing sex. It's like, a cramp, or my stomach hurts. So to me, that's like the number one way to get out of, like, to get to sentiment without the sentimentality, to get to a real love scene or a glorious moment of sex, but without, like, it seeming hallmarky silly. So get in the trash can. So we're out of time, so I just want to end by saying love, It's hard to write about, and that's why I admire Aaron's love poems and others who write about love. They're willing to write about the sentiment, the true sentiment, and they're not shying away from it. I have several author friends who are really well-published, successful authors who confess to me still their reluctance to take characters into the bedroom. And so I'm always encouraging them, like, get over it, let's do it. It's the writer's hard job and privilege to explore and illuminate emotional and psychological truths. It's our hard task to dig and dig hard into the human experience as honestly and fully as possible for our reader, and then to render the most secret recesses of our characters' inner selves. And what is that most guarded place inside of us? We have a lot of secrets. We do. All of us have a lot of secrets, but one of the most guarded, secretive places is our sexuality and all that it entails. We wish it wasn't happening, or when it comes to sex, we wish it wasn't happening, but it is, or it is happening and we wish it wasn't, or it's good, or it's scary, or it's fun. In other words, there's a lot of emotions that go along with it, and it speaks to our existence as a human and as a sexual being. Sex happens, it's part of life, so I think to ignore it in writing is a bad idea. So writers, we can do this. I want to close by mentioning a recent book I read by Richard Powers called The Echo Maker, which won a National Book Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and many of us know his other works as well. It has very little to do with sex, but it has everything to do with the human connection and what it means to be a human on this earth. Thematically, I guess you could say it's about the cranes of Nebraska, neurology, and taking care of the earth, and the love between siblings. But throughout, there are passages about what it means to be a human sexual being. At one point, the neurologist, our main character, Weber, contemplates the state of his marriage, which reflects his own growing sense of insecurity about not having done something more worthwhile in his life. From his point of view, we read, "At growing intervals that neither of them cared to calculate, he and his wife still played with each other. However fitful, the persistence of their desires surprised them both. He had estimated the number of climaxes that he and his wife had shared since their first foray, one every third day on average for a third of a century, 4,000 detonations joining them at the hip. Curled up against his plank, giggling a little, his wife might say, 'Thank you for the beautiful human sexuality, man,' before paddling off to the bathroom to clean up herself. And so this is how we are joined at the hip as humans, in both the loss, the lack, the cleaning up, the mess, the beauty of human sexuality. And I, for one, am grateful to the great writers who have taken this subject on, in its sadness and in its glory. And I plan on literary thieving. I too am hot after the best methods of every writer of my generation, and I plan to keep writing about sex." Thanks for coming out, everybody. Let's stay for that panel.